Alright everyone, welcome to Module 1. In this module, we'll be looking at cognitive science in religious studies. And this is an approach to religious studies that tries to bridge between religion on the one hand and the hard medical science of the human brain on the other hand. There are two required readings for this module. The first is a chapter of Patrick McNamara's book, The Neuroscience of Religious Experience, and the second is a short review essay by Ann Taves that's about McNamara's book. By the end of this module, I hope you'll come away with a sense of just how difficult it is to conduct scientific studies of religion. And I also hope the readings for this module will make you just a little more aware of the kind of assumptions that can influence the way scholars of medicine or science approach the study of religion. One of the most amazing medical breakthroughs of the 20th century was the ability to map the functions of the human brain. MRI machines and other technologies have made it possible for scientists in the last few decades to look into the actual operations of the brain in living people in real time. And from these technologies, researchers have learned the precise locations in the brain that are responsible for things like speaking, reading, seeing shapes, making decisions, and practically everything we experience as embodied beings. We can trace things that once seemed mysterious or special to chemical processes that occur in particular parts of the brain. And given the amazing things that medical science has learned in recent decades about the processes in the brain that control human activities, some researchers have started to wonder what the limits of the technology might be. Cognitive scientists have started to suggest that they might be able to locate the parts of the brain that are responsible for absolutely everything in human experience, including religion. Have you ever wondered if there might be an objective basis to religious claims? Or maybe, can we actually use scientific means to measure religious experiences? Or, to be a little more skeptical about it, have you ever wondered what's really going on in people's brains when they claim they've had religious experiences? Is it something completely mysterious, or something that we can observe and measure with modern medical science? Well, in the 1990s, one scientist in Canada claimed that he had found something called the God spot in the human brain. This was the part of the brain, he claimed, that was responsible for mystical experiences, supernatural encounters like ghost sightings, or just the overwhelming feeling that some people have that convinces them that a divine presence is nearby. And the way that this scientist discovered the so-called God spot was pretty amazing. It involved the use of a device called the God helmet. Basically, this scientist had his undergraduate students volunteer as guinea pigs for an experiment. He then had them put on a modified motorcycle helmet that used electrodes to stimulate activity in certain parts of their brains. When he zapped one particular spot, many test subjects reported that they sensed a presence in the room with them. Some said they felt a calm, reassuring sense that someone or something was nearby, even though they were actually alone in the testing lab. The area of the brain that the God helmet stimulated became known as the God spot. And according to the scientist who ran the study, this was the very spot in the brain that was the source of every human's experience of God, of Buddha mind, divine presence, ghost sightings, higher power, or whatever it happened to be called. The God spot, this scientist argued, was where all religious experiences originated. Now, unfortunately for that researcher, the idea of the God spot never really caught on among brain scientists. Most scientists remained skeptical of his research or suggested that he hadn't actually proven what he thought he had. But the general question has continued to interest scholars. Is there a way to find real, hard data that links people's reported religious experiences with the known functions of the human brain? And we often hear about religion and its supposed relationship to the brain in ordinary conversations in our society. In fact, I would go so far as to say that American culture is almost obsessed with the relationship between religion and the mind. Think about the number of people you know who practice or perform some form of mindfulness meditation. It's an extremely popular practice nowadays, especially among business people and athletes. The basic idea is that the ancient Buddhist practice of silent meditation somehow gives a person greater control over their own body and their mind. Or if you don't know anyone who does mindfulness meditation, think about the number of people in our society who practice yoga for their physical and mental well-being. Even if they aren't Hindus themselves, lots of people seem to think that yoga is an especially powerful spiritual practice, something that gives a person greater power or awareness over the mind and the body. So I think it's fair to say that American society seems pretty confident that religion operates right at the nexus of the body, the mind, and the greater ultimate forces of the universe. Or just think about how often you've heard people suggest that religion is an instinctive capacity of the human brain. Think about how often you've heard someone suggest that everybody has an innate concept or awareness of religion, a mental predisposition to believe in a higher power. I've certainly heard scientists suggest that human beings evolved to have a religious sensibility. They contend that belief in a god or a higher power is somehow hardwired into the human brain, and that it gave our ancestors some kind of advantage in their habitat. So, ways of studying religion as a cognitive function, as an operation of the brain, or something that sits right at the intersection of the brain and the mind. These kinds of approaches to the study of religion seem to have a great deal of credibility in American society. Many people seem to assume that it's only a matter of time before we'll pinpoint exactly where religion happens in the brain, and then we'll harness that knowledge for our own good. So with all of that in the back of our heads, let's look closely now at the McNamara reading. What you've read is a chapter from the book, The Neuroscience of Religious Experience. And the book was originally published in 2009. Patrick McNamara is an expert in the medicine of the human mind. He's a professor at the Boston University School of Medicine, and he's one of the world's leading medical researchers into the effects of Parkinson's disease on the human brain. I don't know if you've ever known someone with Parkinson's disease, but it's a terrible degenerative illness. It's a disease of the brain that most often, but not exclusively, affects elderly people. Now, I'm certainly not a medical doctor, but here's my understanding of how the disease works. Basically, Parkinson's disease causes a malfunction and death of the cells in the brain. And these dying cells then change the production of certain chemicals in the brain that are responsible for coordinating movement and regulating other brain functions like processing information or experiencing happiness. Eventually, people with Parkinson's disease lose the ability to control their movements. They often experience an uncontrollable shaking in the arms and the legs, as well as a loss of control over the muscles of the face. The disease can cause dementia, personality changes, memory loss, and an inability to think clearly. Parkinson's disease, in effect, can take someone who you know and love and transform them into a completely different person. Eventually, it usually results in death. It's truly a horrible disease, and McNamara is one of the world's leading experts in how this disease works in the brain. And I think it's important for us to recognize that McNamara's research about Parkinson's disease is extremely well known among medical scientists. His medical expertise shapes how he studies religion. McNamara works in a medical lab and he helps to train medical doctors. To put it bluntly, he scans people's brains for a living. He tries to figure out how diseases of the brain affect people's mental abilities, their body movements, their personalities, and their experiences. He studies how a terrible brain disease can transform someone you know and love into a stranger who can no longer think or act like they used to. For McNamara, our personalities, actions, and experiences are all the result of chemical and biological processes inside the brain. So it makes sense that he would locate religion in the functions of the human brain as well. He thinks the chemical and electrical processes of our brains can explain pretty much everything about our experiences. And that includes people's religious experiences. McNamara is trying to use what he knows about brains to come up with a general theory that explains what's actually happening when people say they're having religious experiences. He's trying to be objective and scientific, and he's trying to understand and then locate how religion operates in the brain and where specifically in the brain it is occurring. So let's outline McNamara's theory of religious experience. McNamara argues that religious experience consists of this process he calls decentering the self. Now, I realize that some of his language can be a little confusing since most of us are probably not psychologists in this class, but I think the overall message that he has is pretty straightforward. McNamara's overall point is that religion involves changing yourself into a more ideal version of what you think a human being should be. To do that, you have to stop being who you currently are and make adjustments to yourself. Whether you're a Buddhist and you're trying to achieve enlightenment, a Christian trying to be more like Jesus or the saints, or a Muslim trying to follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad, McNamara says it's all the same basic activity in the brain that's happening. What's happening is you're transforming your current self into a better self. On the top of page 46, McNamara hints at a particular location in the brain where all of this religious self-transformation is taking place. He says it's primarily happening in, quote, right-sided orbital frontal, dorsomedial and dorsolateral prefrontal, and anterior temporal networks, unquote. So, have you got that? Okay, now take a deep breath and relax because you definitely don't have to remember that for this class. I am certainly not going to be testing you on brain biology, but it's important to see the big picture of what's going on. McNamara is a neuroscientist, and he thinks religion is primarily about transformations that occur to a person's sense of self. He thinks religion happens when people change their personal identity, decisions, will, and feelings to bring them more into line with that of some ideal person they want to be like. As a neuroscientist, he knows that there are very specific, particular regions of the brain that are responsible for things like having a sense of self, for making decisions, and for choosing whether to act or not to act. There's a part of the brain that's responsible for you doing or not doing something. And there's a nearby part of the brain that's responsible for you deciding if who you are is the person who you would like to be. There's another nearby region that's all about your current sense of self. And he suggests that when religion happens, it's happening in these specific regions of the brain. He's trying to suggest that there's an objective, measurable brain activity that happens in religion. And he's spelling out for us exactly what those brain functions are. So on the bottom of page 46 and the top of page 47, he outlines the process of decentering the self that he thinks is the core of religion. And in this, he uses some strange technical jargon, but again, I think the big picture is pretty straightforward. He thinks religion works something like this. First, your sense of agency or your will gets put temporarily on hold. You no longer act as you had normally been acting. You no longer continue to do what you had usually been doing. You no longer wish to do the same things that you've always been doing. You enter the temple to perform a ritual. You close your eyes to pray. You take the sacred drugs and you go into a trance. However it happens doesn't really matter for McNamara. What matters is, in religion, people temporarily put the ordinary self, their ordinary choices, actions, and desires on hold. Second, you start to imagine that you could be different. You realize that you could do different things. You imagine that you could choose to want to do different things. You admit you have a problem and you need help. You enter the spirit world. You think about the path to enlightenment and what's required of a person to become more enlightened. You place your self-concept in suppositional space. You start to imagine yourself in different ways. Stage 3, your brain starts to look for ways to make your current self more like how you want to be. You look for models to follow. Your brain searches through its memory banks to try to find examples of the kind of person who doesn't have the, quote, internal and external conflicts and problems, unquote, that you are having. Maybe it's Jesus, or Buddha, or the Prophet Muhammad, or Gandhi, or Moses, or your grandmother. Again, for McNamara, it doesn't matter. What matters for him is that in a religious experience, your brain imagines how you might be more like the person you want to be. You search for optimal selves. Very often, he suggests on page 51 and following, what happens in this stage is that your brain searches for ideal models from stories that it remembers. And your brain starts to tell you, you can be more like the hero of that story. But here's what you would need to do that. And then fourth and finally, the stage 4 of religious experience is that your brain discovers a way of connecting who you used to be with the more ideal person you imagine you can be. The brain tells you that you are now on the path to enlightenment. You are becoming a better person of faith. You are following in the footsteps of the prophet. You have changed your evil ways and you're doing better. McNamara says on page 47, quote, "If all goes well, the new identity is larger and more complex than the older self, and thus it is more unified," unquote. So when religion is working properly, he suggests, it results in a more complex and unified sense of self. In other words, religion produces good psychological results. It makes people kinder, better able to deal with more complex problems, better able to solve their own internal and external conflicts. It makes them more at peace with themselves and with the world. Now, McNamara also suggests that the process of decentering that happens in religion can go awry. On pages 57 and 58, he identifies quote-unquote religious fanaticism as one possible outcome of the decentering process when it goes wrong. The issue, he says, comes in stage 3, when the brain is supposed to be looking for better possible versions of the self, for new ideals to follow. He argues that instead of looking for a new and better self to resolve the problems of life, religious fanatics assume they are already the best possible version of themselves, and they end up reinforcing their own assumptions, their old self, rather than finding a new and improved one. They assume they have all the answers already, they don't think there is any improvement to be made, so they in effect become narcissists. They think they were already perfect, and they think that their devotion to their religious principles confirms that they were already perfect. So let's try to summarize McNamara's views up to this point. For him, religion is all about individuals. More than that, for him, religion is about individuals experiencing a transformation of the self. Religion is about willful action, changes to individual desires and motivations, and patterning one's life story in relation to ideals that we hold in our heads. For him, religion is about enlarging and improving one's sense of self. It happens entirely, completely in the human mind. Rituals and other actions are just gateways to a changed mind. Religious stories shape individual minds and help people improve themselves. When the process breaks down, people don't enlarge or improve their sense of self through religion. Instead, he says, religion becomes a path to narcissism, to the assumption that the self is already perfect and doesn't need transformation or improvement. Now, so far, I've been working hard to give you a charitable understanding of McNamara. I've been trying to be fair to him and to his ideas, and I've been trying to point out the strength of his argument. But now I have a confession to make, and that confession is that only a tiny handful of scholars of religion take his approach seriously. So I want to turn now to the Ann Taves article and see what she has to say about the matter. Ann Taves is the former president of the American Academy of Religion. And I would say her essay is basically the academic equivalent of a complete and total smackdown of McNamara. As far as I'm concerned, Taves is completely and totally destroys McNamara's argument. Ann Taves is not a brain scientist. She was trained as a historian of religions in the United States. But she has a strong interest in religious experiences, and she's written about religious experiences in relation to cognitive science. So she certainly knows the kind of material that McNamara is using, and at least in theory, she's open to his general approach. But she points out some major problems with his argument. The biggest problem Taves identifies with McNamara's approach to religious studies is that he assumes way too much about what religion is and how religion works. On page 87 of her article, she says, quote, "In trying to explain religion in general terms of the building up of a self that more closely approximates an ideal that he specifies, he loses the ability to explain how traditions build up the self to approximate ideals that they specify," unquote. Later in the paragraph, Taves explains exactly what she means by that. McNamara treats religion as a medical phenomenon. And really, what else would we expect? He's a medical scientist, after all. The trouble for Taves is that medicine really doesn't care about what you think is happening. It doesn't care how you explain events. Medicine has its own explanations for things, and it really cares only about outcomes, improved symptoms, better test results, and ultimately a cure for whatever disease it is a person has. But that type of approach doesn't necessarily help us make sense of what people are thinking, saying, and doing when they have experiences that get called religious experiences. Specifically, Taves says a little further down on page 87 that McNamara's approach, quote, "does not leave enough room for the possibility that culturally conceived and culturally driven processes of transformation might lead to the formation of selves that he views as less than optimal," unquote. In other words, Taves is suggesting that McNamara assumes there's such a thing as good religion and bad religion. And he thinks that if a religion doesn't do what he thinks it should do by making individuals into better versions of themselves, then it's illegitimate. It's a bad religion. And this is not something that scholars of religion generally do. Scholars of religion like Ann Taves usually try to understand what religious practitioners themselves think about what they're doing. And Taves points out that there are lots of religious traditions that don't consider themselves to fit the pattern of what McNamara thinks religions should do. These religions value different kinds of things and even different kinds of understandings of the self than McNamara thinks they should. And Taves is arguing that there's no reason to impose McNamara's values on these traditions. To do so erases what these traditions are really all about, and it dismisses their self-understandings unfairly. Taves gives the example of Pentecostalism as a challenge to McNamara's assumptions about religion. Remember that McNamara thinks the ultimate goal of religion is an enlarged and transformed sense of self. Taves observes that Pentecostal Christians actively try to cultivate the experience of what they call being baptized in the Holy Spirit. When the Holy Spirit baptizes a person, that person often experiences overwhelming emotions and starts to speak in what Pentecostal Christians call the gift of tongues. Now, these are languages that don't necessarily equate to human languages. They are languages understood only by God. So, in short, when Pentecostal Christians cultivate this experience, they're not trying to enlarge or transform their individual self into a better version of itself. Pentecostal Christians usually say they're actually trying to abandon their individual sense of self in order to become open to the overwhelming influence of God. They'll say they're trying to lose control over their individual will and surrender themselves completely to God's influence. And for them, the evidence that that has happened is that they speak in tongues. They speak in a language that might not make sense to outsiders, but is understood by God. So, in other words, Pentecostals don't actually want to experience a transformed or enlarged self through their religion. They want to diminish the presence of the self as much as possible in order to have a powerful religious experience. McNamara's understanding of religion basically dismisses Pentecostalism and similar kinds of traditions as being a diseased form of religion. He thinks that religion that doesn't cultivate an enlarged and improved sense of self is a failed religion, a bad religion, a diseased religion. And Taves thinks there's no reason to assume that such traditions are, in fact, bad religions. She points out that religions provide lots of different understandings of the self. And some of these religions value things that seem totally wrong according to McNamara's understanding of how religion supposedly should work. Lots of religions try actively to cultivate a loss of the self, whether through possession by spirits or total surrender to the deity. And Taves thinks we scholars shouldn't dismiss those self-descriptions. If Pentecostal Christians say they want to abandon their ordinary selves to be overcome by the Spirit of God, why should someone like McNamara suggest that's an illegitimate form of religion? If someone thinks they need to sacrifice what they want for what a deity wants of them, why would we assume this is abnormal or bad? If a person actively cultivates possession by spirits and insists that they lose their individuality in the process, who are we as scholars of religion to say that that's not a legitimate religion? According to their own descriptions of themselves, religious practitioners very often do not try to achieve the enlarged senses of the self that McNamara thinks they should try to achieve. And Taves thinks that as scholars of religion, we shouldn't be telling religions what they can or can't do, or what they should or shouldn't value. For Taves, McNamara's cognitive approach doesn't take people's own self-understandings and self-descriptions of their religions seriously enough. He dismisses what people actually think about their own religions, the words they actually use to describe their own religious experiences, their own descriptions of what their traditions value. He dismisses all of that in order to arrive at his supposedly objective and medical conclusions. Taves thinks scholars of religion should not impose our own frameworks on traditions from the outside, but instead we should let people explain to us why they think they're doing what they do in their religions. The real heart of the debate between Taves and McNamara is this: should we, as scholars of religion, be describing and understanding what other people think about their religions, or should we be telling them what we think about their religions? For Taves, it's the first option. She thinks that as scholars of religion, we have an obligation to take people's own self-descriptions really seriously. She thinks we need to try to understand how religions work according to their own internal logic, rather than imposing our own frameworks and values onto them from the outside. McNamara argues that we should take the second option. He thinks there are objective electrochemical processes happening in the brains of religious people, whether they want to admit it or not. He thinks his model adequately explains how religion works in the brain. And he thinks differences in religious people's self-descriptions are just different names for the same fundamental processes of the brain. Now, as far as I'm personally concerned as a scholar of religion, I think when you start to see things from Ann Taves's viewpoint, McNamara's supposedly scientific and objective argument really starts to fall apart. McNamara says religion is all about individuals and their sense of self. But why would we assume that that's true? Lots of religions suggest that the human self is actually like the most fundamental problem that human beings have. Some religions say that the self is like the one thing in the world that needs to be overcome, that the self needs to be recognized as impermanent, the self needs to be dissolved, the self needs to be pressed down as much as possible or completely annihilated on the path to salvation or enlightenment or to making it rain. McNamara also thinks all religion is about the individual's volitional, willful process of self-transformation. And again, we have to ask, why would we assume that that's the only way religion might happen? Religious people themselves often describe seeking out a loss of control over themselves. They try to abandon themselves to the spirits or to God or to the ancestors or whatever. They say that they aren't necessarily trying to become better or more enlarged versions of themselves in this process of abandoning the self. Often they'll tell us that they're trying to obtain a vision. They're trying to get a blessing. They're trying to curse their enemies, or they're trying to cause it to rain. Sometimes people describe their religious activities as being much more mundane than some grand process of mental self-transformation. Very often, people are just trying to do a ritual action to produce a specific result. Their individual will has almost nothing to do with it. And McNamara also thinks that religion ultimately happens only in the individual human mind. But why would we assume that that's the case? Many religious practitioners say their religion can only happen in the collective actions of groups. It's not an internal transformation at all that happens, but an external process of doing the right things. If the group performs the ritual incorrectly, they'll say that it won't produce the right results. Very often, religion does not seem to be about individuals attaining a new sense of self inside their minds. According to people's own descriptions, their religions are often about groups of people trying to do things collectively, to perform rituals the right way, to achieve specific results like a good harvest, victory over enemies, increased wealth, or the blessing of a god. McNamara's approach to religion has the advantage of being measurable. He presents religion as something that can be identified and monitored inside the brain. And I think lots of people in our society tend to assume that this sort of information is especially authoritative and especially reliable, right? Information, medical information like that seems objective. But if we start to question his scholarly assumptions, McNamara's approach starts to seem a lot less objective and a lot less reliable. We can see that he's making lots of assumptions about what religion is and how it works. Now, according to Ann Taves, McNamara's approach makes assumptions that completely erase what people themselves think and say about their own religions. And most scholars of religion think that that's a major red flag. Most scholars of religion think that we have some kind of obligation to keep other people's understandings of their own religions intact. We think that we can't just dismiss the internal logic of a religious tradition because it doesn't make sense according to our own theories. Taves and scholars like her think that we as scholars of religion have to come up with ways of studying other religions that make sense of their own understandings, their own ways of experiencing, categorizing, and describing the world. We have to show how religions work from the inside, according to the people who actually believe and practice them. Now, this isn't to suggest that Ann Taves thinks we can't think critically about what people say about their religions. But what she is saying is that we can't just dismiss entire religious traditions as diseases or as bad religion when we don't like the things that they say about themselves. I wanted to start with this approach to religious studies because I think it holds a lot of authority in our culture. People tend to think that medical science is unassailable, that it's unquestionably true in everything that it says. But frankly, I don't think science has all the answers when it comes to studying religion. McNamara's method of studying religion certainly has some major positive qualities, right? It's measurable. It's at least trying to be objective. And certainly it produces lots and lots of hard data. But it also has some major drawbacks. One big one is that it doesn't care at all about people's own understandings of themselves, their experience of the world, and their religious values. It suggests that some religions simply don't count as real religion. McNamara's approach makes implicit value judgments about which religions are good and which religions are bad. It makes all kinds of assumptions about where quote-unquote real religion happens, how it happens, who's involved, and how it can be analyzed. Now, I'm not going to tell you what you have to think about the cognitive science approach to religious studies. I will, however, be happy if you come away from this class with just a little bit more skepticism about scientists' claims about religion. As far as I'm concerned, every method of studying religion has its own biases and its own assumptions, no matter how objective it claims to be. And so if we're going to be responsible scholars of religion, we have to think carefully about the kinds of assumptions and value judgments that we are willing to make. Are we willing to impose our own understandings of religion on other people, no matter what the consequences are? Are we willing to tell someone that their understanding of their own religion is wrong just because our theory says it's wrong? Or are we willing, on the other hand, to live with the murkiness, the cloudiness, the vagueness that's inherent in letting people explain to us what they think their religion is and how they think it works? Are we willing to put objectivity aside in order to learn more about how other people experience and understand the world? So that's all for this module. In the next module, we'll be looking at an approach to religious studies that focuses very carefully on the language that scholars use to describe religion and the kinds of implicit value judgments that our language can reveal. Have a good week, everyone. Please let me know if you have any questions about this material. Remember, I'm always happy to help.